The family courtroom in downtown Denver smelled of industrial floor cleaner and old paper. A cold, clean scent, like a five-star hotel at 3 in the morning, after the last guest has gone to their room and the cleaning crew begins their silent work. Nathan Cole sat at the end of a wooden bench on the left, hands clasped, watching the winter light slide along the tall panes of glass behind the judge. He wasn't hearing everything clearly. Not really. He only caught isolated phrases rising above the rustle of papers and the steady hum of the air conditioning in the ceiling. Asset division, joint holdings, residential transfer, executive compensation, 31 years of marriage, 31 years. Victoria's lawyer in a charcoal suit spoke of their marriage as if he were reading a fourth quarter financial report to the board of directors. Nathan looked down at his hands. He'd used these hands to fix the water heater at the Aspen Ridge Hotel in the middle of Christmas Eve when a pipe burst and the entire VIP floor lost hot water. He'd driven 3 hours through a blizzard himself to get a kitchen staffer back to the resort when the head chef had a heart attack. He'd slept on the sofa in the operations office for 4 straight days when the Park City Hotel had a power failure in the winter of 2009. No one in the courtroom knew those stories. Maybe Victoria didn't even remember them anymore. Nathan Cole agrees to relinquish operational claims regarding Aurelia Resorts Group. Relinquish. A pretty word for being torn away from the life he'd spent more than half of his own keeping afloat. Nathan looked up. Victoria sat opposite him in a pale cream suit, her blonde hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. She was still beautiful in the way wealthy women are often beautiful, not with youth, but with control. Everything about Victoria was always under control. Her schedule, the atmosphere in a room, the pace of a conversation, her facial expressions. Even her kindness was often perfectly timed. The Cartier watch on her wrist reflected the cold lights overhead. Victoria didn't look at Nathan much. It wasn't out of hatred. It was worse than that. She looked at him the way one looks at a room they've lived in for too long and have finally decided to renovate. Lauren sat next to her mother. Their daughter, 28 this year, was a brand manager for a high-end interior design firm in Scottsdale. Lauren wore a light camel coat, Italian leather boots, and the wool scarf Nathan had bought for her in Chicago years ago. She didn't look at her father any more than her mother did. Nathan didn't blame her. Lauren had grown up in Victoria's world. Cocktail events, fundraisers, hotel galas, private schools, country clubs, places where men were judged by job titles, stock shares, watches, home addresses, the kind of cars they drove, and Nathan was always just the man in the back, the problem solver, the one who showed up when things went wrong, the guy everyone needed at 2 in the morning, but whose name no one remembered the next day. Mr. Cole retains sole ownership of the inherited commercial property located outside Silver Peak, Utah. Nathan blinked. It was his father's garage, Turner Mountain Service. An old garage on a mountain road north of Silver Peak. He hadn't been back there since his father's funeral nearly 9 years ago. Victoria's lawyer turned another page. The property has minimal assessed value, minimal. Nathan almost laughed. That garage had been his entire world as a child. The smell of engine oil, the weather radio, burnt coffee on the hot plate, the crack of an impact wrench cutting through the falling snow. But on paper, it was just minimal assessed value, an almost worthless asset. Mr. Cole also retains possession of the 2008 Chevrolet Silverado currently registered under his name. The old Chevy. Victoria had always hated that truck. She said it made the valets at the Aspen Hotel look at him more like the maintenance guy than the CEO's husband. Nathan had thought about selling it once. But Frank, his father, had said, a good truck is one that starts on the coldest morning of the year. Nathan still had it. Personal belongings have been packed and transferred. Nathan knew what that meant. A few boxes left outside the penthouse garage this morning. 31 years of a life fitting into a few brown cardboard boxes. The meeting was over sooner than Nathan had expected. No one got angry. No one cried. No one screams about how much they once loved the other person. That only happens in the movies. In real life, long marriages usually end in exhaustion, like a hotel going dark after the season's over. The judge signs the papers. People stand up, the soft scrape of wooden chairs on the floor, the thud of a closing file. A few brief handshakes, and just like that, it's over. 31 years. Nathan gets to his feet slower than everyone else. He feels a dull ache in his knees from sitting for so long. No one notices. Victoria is saying something to her lawyer. Lauren is checking her phone. A paralegal walks past Nathan, a hot latte in her hand, without a single glance in his direction. Nathan stands in the middle of the room where his life just ended and realizes something strange. No one asks him, "Are you okay?" Not Victoria, not Lauren, not the lawyers. No one. That stings more than he thought it would. Nathan grips the car keys in his pocket and walks out. The marble lobby of the courthouse downstairs is polished and cold. The scent of expensive perfume hangs in the air. A group of businessmen near the elevators are discussing a new resort project in Vail. The rhythmic click of heels echoes across the stone floor. A man in a black cashmere coat walks past Nathan, instinctively sidestepping him as if he were a delivery guy in the way. Nathan pushes through the revolving glass doors. A blast of cold wind whips across his face. Denver is getting its first snow of the season. Not much. Just a light dusting, swirling in the wind between the glass buildings. His Chevy Silverado is parked half a block away. A brand new Mercedes SUV is idling in front of it, a valet in a long coat holding the door open. Nathan catches his reflection in the SUV's polished black-tinted window. Gray hair, a worn dark brown coat, boots stained with road salt. He looks more like the man who's here to fix the furnace than the man who once ran operations for a five-star hotel chain worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe he always was. Nathan opens the door to the Chevy. The door let out a familiar, weary creak. He placed the cardboard box on the passenger seat. Inside was a few photo albums, his father's watch, an old jacket, the deed to the garage, a couple of books, a ceramic mug, chipped at the rim, that Lauren had given him for Father's Day when she was 8. World's best dad. The words had almost worn away completely. Nathan sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the car. Outside, the snow was starting to fall thicker. He took out his phone to check his bank account. $187.14. He stared at that number for a long time. Then he let out a short, quiet laugh, just to himself. A man who once helped run a resort with a presidential suite that went for $12,000 a night was down to $187. The phone vibrated. A text from Lauren. "Dad, I'm glad this is finally over. Mom's exhausted. Drive safe." Nathan stared at the glowing screen in the dark cabin. He typed, "Love you too," then deleted it. Then he typed, "Drive safe back home." He looked at the words for a few seconds before hitting send. Home. Nathan didn't have a home anymore. The penthouse in Denver belonged to Victoria now. In truth, it had always belonged to Victoria. Nathan had just been living in it. He pushed the key into the ignition. The Chevy's engine turned over on the second try, its rumble heavy but steady. The radio came on by itself. An old jazz tune played softly through the static. Nathan let it play. He pulled the Chevy from the curb, merging into the line of luxury cars, queued up in front of the Four Seasons across the street. Valet in white gloves ran to open doors for guests. Yellow light reflected on the snow-wet pavement. Behind him, Denver glowed and cold as an ad for expensive perfume. Nathan drove north, towards Utah, towards the mountain range where an old garage stood, listed on the legal documents as minimal assessed value. The snow grew heavier as he left the city, and for the first time in a very long time, Nathan Cole had no idea where his life was going next. Nathan left Denver around 3 in the afternoon. By the time the last of the glass towers disappeared in his rearview mirror, snow was already blanketing the shoulders of the interstate. The distant mountains rose against the opaque gray sky, stretching out like a vast sleeping wall. He drove for hours, mostly without music. The old Chevy vibrated slightly whenever the wheels rolled over a thin patch of ice on the road. The heater worked in fits and starts. Every so often, it would blast a gust of dry, hot air before falling silent again, as if the truck itself was tired after years of being forgotten on the sidelines of a rich man's life. Nathan stopped for gas in Evanston just before dark. The convenience store at the gas station smelled of grilling hot dogs and burnt coffee. A man in a deer hunting jacket was watching the weather forecast on a TV mounted in the corner. "Big storms rolling over the Wasatch tonight," the man said without looking at Nathan. "If you're headed for Silver Peak, you'll want to be there before 8. Nathan nodded. "Thanks." He bought a black coffee and went back to the truck. It was much colder than it had been in Denver. The mountain cold wasn't sharp like a knife, but heavy like stone, seeping into his sleeves and collar and settling there. Nathan continued driving north. The road began to narrow as he left the interstate for the state highway leading up to Silver Peak. Snow-covered pines stood on both sides of the road, tall and silent in the fading light. He remembered this road, remembered every curve. Frank Cole had taught him to drive a truck on this mountain route when Nathan was 14. "Don't look at the spot right in front of the hood," his father used to say. "Look where you want the truck to go." Nathan had never forgotten that. The last of the light vanished as he saw the old sign. Silver Peak, population 2,104. A few yellow lights appeared down in the valley. The town was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he was the one who had changed. Nathan drove for another 10 minutes before he saw the garage. Turner Mountain Service. The old neon sign above the awning was only half lit. The word Turner flickered a faint, pale red in the thickening snow. The garage sat flush against the mountain road like something forgotten by time. The two metal bay doors were caked with road salt and dust. An old tow truck was parked at an angle to the left of the building. The awning sagged in one corner. Nathan slowed. The Chevy's engine gave a low rumble, then died as he parked in front of the garage. Silence. Not the silence of his Denver penthouse, with its soundproof glass and air filtration system. This was mountain silence, deep and cold. Nathan sat in the truck for a few more seconds before getting out. The snow crunched under his boots. The air smelled of cold pine and old metal. He opened the trunk, took out a toolbox, and walked to the garage door. The set of keys Frank had left was still in the glove compartment. Nathan tried the second key. The lock resisted for a moment before clicking open with a dry, metallic sound. The first smell that hit him was old motor oil, then dust, and then that unique smell of a mountain garage, rubber, cold metal, stale coffee, and winter. Nathan stood still in the darkness. The air inside was so cold he could see his breath. He felt for the switch on the wall. The fluorescent light above flickered a few times before humming to life with a pale blue glow. The garage was almost untouched, as if Frank had just left last night. The toolboard still covered the back wall. Every wrench had a hand-drawn black outline beneath it, so you'd know if one was missing. Frank hated it when his tools were out of place. Nathan stepped closer. His finger traced over the old impact wrench hanging on the right. He remembered dropping it when he was 16 and how Frank made him clean the entire garage that night. "Tools take care of the people who make a living with them," his father used to say. In the corner, the old weather radio was still on its shelf. A thick layer of dust coated the faded silver plastic. Nathan tried the power button. The radio let out a weak crackle, and then an announcer's voice came through, breaking up. "Winter warning across northern mountain corridors." Nathan almost laughed. Frank always had that radio on, every single day, for 20 years. Some people need the stock market report to get by. Frank Cole needed the snow forecast. Nathan set his toolbox on the workbench and walked deeper into the garage. The small office in the back was still there. The old coffee maker, a wall calendar from 9 years ago, a swivel chair with cracked leather seams, an olive-drab metal filing cabinet. Nathan pulled open the top drawer, tow reports, emergency road calls, weather closures. The tow records were carefully filed by year. Frank kept everything. Nathan pulled out a file. January 12th, stranded family near mile marker 18. February 4th, truck jackknife during storm. March 9th, cabin generator repair. Frank never just fixed cars. Nathan was starting to remember that. This garage had been more like a rescue station than a repair shop. People called Frank at all hours when their car died. They were lost, they were stuck in the snow, the power went out. Their heater broke in the middle of winter. Nathan pulled up a chair and sat down. The old furnace was silent. He tried the wall heater. Nothing happened, just the dry click of the switch. "Of course," he muttered. He took off his coat and, on old reflex, started checking the electrical panel. His hands still remembered everything. That surprised him. After almost 30 years in a suit inside a luxury hotel, his body still remembered how a garage worked. Outside, the wind started to pick up. Snow lashed against the window panes. Nathan worked on the heater for almost an hour before it rumbled to life with a heavy groan. Warm air slowly spread through the garage. He made coffee with the old machine Frank used to use. The coffee was terrible. Nathan drank it anyway. He sat alone under the pale green glow of the fluorescent lights, listening to the heater's hum and the wind howling in the mountains. It was the first night in 31 years he hadn't heard the hum of a hotel air purifier, hadn't heard an elevator, Hadn't heard a work phone. Hadn't heard Victoria moving between rooms like a well-organized cold front. There was the mountain wind, the weather radio, and the ticking of the Chevy's engine as it cooled in the lot. Nathan had almost fallen asleep in the chair when the radio suddenly crackled to life. Whiteout conditions approaching Silver Peak Corridor. Just then he heard the screech of brakes outside. A long skid, then a heavy impact. Nathan shot to his feet. He ran to the front door. The snow was almost completely obscuring the road now. About 50 meters in front of the garage, a black Range Rover was tilted, half submerged in a snow-filled ditch. Its headlights were still on. Nathan didn't think twice. He grabbed his coat and a flashlight and bolted outside. The cold wind slammed into his face. Snow whipped across like sand. The SUV was stuck deeper than he'd thought. Nathan banged on the driver's side window. A man in his 40s opened the door from the inside. "We're stuck!" he yelled over the wind. "My wife and 2 kids are in the car." Nathan shone his flashlight inside. A woman was holding a little girl in the back seat. A boy about 10 years old sat huddled with a blanket wrapped around him. "Engine still running?" Nathan asked. "Yeah." "Good, don't turn off the heater." Nathan turned back to the garage and ran to get the tow chains. His body moved before his mind could even catch up, fast, precise, as if he'd never left this place. 10 minutes later, the Chevy was roaring through the snow, pulling the Range Rover out of the ditch. The wheels spun violently before the SUV finally lurched back onto the road. The man stepped out, snow dusted the shoulders of his expensive cashmere coat. "Jesus," he panted. "Thank God." Nathan just nodded. "The road north is even worse. You should stay here till the storm passes." The man looked at the garage behind Nathan. "I didn't know anyone was still operating out here." Nathan glanced at the neon sign flickering through the curtain of snow. "To be honest," he said quietly, "neither did I." The man laughed softly, then looked at Nathan more closely. Something on his face changed. "Wait a minute," he said. "Are you Frank Cole's son?" Nathan froze. "Yeah." The man stared at the garage for a few more seconds. The wind howled down the dark mountain road behind them. Then he spoke again, his voice much quieter. "Frank Cole saved me in 1998. The next morning, Nathan woke to the sound of wind rattling the metal front door of the garage. It took him a few seconds to remember where he was. The low ceiling, the smell of old motor oil, the felt sofa was so stiff his back ached dully, and the quiet static of the weather radio from the back office. Outside, snow was still falling. A cold gray light filtered through the dusty, fogged-up glass of the garage door. Nathan sat up slowly, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The heater was running, but it was weak. It made a steady, vibrating sound, like an old man trying to take a deep breath through winter. He walked to the glass in the front door. The black Range Rover was still parked in the lot. Thick snow covered nearly half its wheels. The air outside was so still, Nathan could hear the snow landing on the metal awning. A moment later, the door to the small back office opened. The man from last night stepped out, a cup of coffee in his hand. He was wearing a dark gray cashmere sweater instead of the heavy coat from the night before. He was in his 40s, with the clean-cut hair of a big city finance guy, but his eyes looked much more tired now. "Are your wife and the kids still sleeping in the car?" Nathan asked. "No. I got them a room at the motel down the road. They had one left." He lifted the coffee cup to his nose and gave a small smile. "The coffee here is still as bad as it used to be." Nathan watched him for a few seconds. "I take it you've been here before, many times. Back in the late 90s, my father drove a truck route from Salt Lake up to Montana. His engine died in a blizzard near mile marker 14. He looked around the garage. Frank Cole towed us back here at almost 2 in the morning. Nathan was silent. The man walked slowly over to the tool board at the back. "He let my whole family sleep in the loft, even made us chili on an old gas stove. I still remember the smell of motor oil and the sound of that weather radio all night." Nathan didn't say anything more. There was something strange about hearing a stranger talk about his father like he was an important memory, especially when he himself hadn't thought much about him for years. The man held out his hand. "Daniel Mercer." Nathan shook it. Daniel looked around the garage again. "You know, back then everyone who drove this mountain pass knew Frank." Nathan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel let out a small laugh. "I mean, if your car died in the middle of winter on Silver Peak, you either called a tow company from Ogden and waited 6 hours in the snow, or you hoped Frank Cole picked up your signal on the radio first." Nathan glanced toward the old radio on the shelf. A low static still crackled with the intermittent voice of the weather forecast. Daniel finished his coffee and pulled out his wallet model. "Let me pay for last night." "There's no need," Nathan answered almost reflexively. Daniel looked at him for a few seconds, then chuckled softly as if he'd just realized something. Just like Frank, he left his business card on the counter. Mercer Capital Partners. Nathan stared at the card long after Daniel had left. The Range Rover slowly disappeared into the white curtain of snow on the mountain road. The garage fell silent again. Nathan went back to the small office in the back. Dusty lights settled on Frank's old desk. He opened a few more file drawers. Weather logs, dispatch records, tow requests. Everything was written in Frank's blocky handwriting. January 18th, snowdrift rescue near Canyon Road. February 2nd, generator delivery to widow on Pine Hill. March 11th, free brake repair for truck driver from Idaho. Nathan pulled up a chair and sat down. He began to read through the files, one by one. The more he read, the more he realized this garage had never operated like a normal business. Frank barely seemed to care about making money. Many tow slips had no payment invoice attached, just a note, paid later. Or, family had kids. Some even said, don't charge. Nathan opened another file box. Inside were old pale yellow dispatch slips, radio frequency notes, snow conditions, accident locations, ski patrol requests. Many nights Frank had practically driven all over the mountain range. Nathan remembered waking up once at 3 a.m. and his father wasn't there. Frank came home just before dawn, his jacket covered in snow and his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Back then, Nathan just thought his father loved to work too much. Now he understood. Frank didn't run this garage for the cars. He did it for the people. Nathan stood up and walked toward the glass door. Outside, the wind was still howling along the snow-covered mountain road. A large truck drove by slowly, its amber lights fading into the blizzard. Nathan looked at the Turner Mountain Service sign, reflected on the cold glass. He suddenly realized something strange. Since he'd been back, no one had asked what he used to do for Aurelia Resorts. No one cared that he once lived in a penthouse. No one asked about Victoria. They only asked, "Are you Frank Cole's son?" For the first time in years, Nathan felt the name Cole meant something more than a legal file or a business card. Around noon, an old, red pickup truck parked outside the garage. An old man with a silver beard stepped out, wearing an old ski patrol jacket. He looked at Nathan for a few seconds, then laughed. "My God, you really are Nathan Cole." It took Nathan a moment to recognize him. Hank Wheeler. When he was a kid, Nathan had followed the man a few times to fix snowmobiles. Hank walked into the garage, stomping the snow from his boots. "I heard on the radio the garage lights were back on last night. Figured someone had bought the place." Nathan shook his head. "Not yet. I guess it's still mine." Hank looked around the garage with an almost nostalgic gaze. Frank would be happy to know this place was lit up again. Nathan leaned against the counter. "Do people around here really miss him that much?" Hank looked at him as if the question was a bit strange. "Nathan, your father towed nearly half this valley." He walked over to the file cabinet and tapped lightly on the old metal surface. "During the winter storm of 2003, Frank worked for 3 days straight, no sleep, rescued 2 families stranded near Canyon Ridge." Nathan listened in silence. He had never known these stories. Hank chuckled softly. Frank wasn't one to brag. He just liked to keep the garage lights on. The wind slammed against the front glass again. The radio crackled softly in the corner. Nathan looked around the garage one more time. Dust on the light bulbs. Old oil stains on the concrete floor. The folding chair next to the heater. The faded coffee maker. Everything was so old. But for the first time since leaving Denver, Nathan no longer felt like he was standing in the wreckage. He was starting to feel like he was standing in the middle of something unfinished. Hank was about to leave when he suddenly remembered something. Oh, right. He pointed toward the back of the garage. Frank had a locked room behind the stockroom. He wouldn't let anyone in there but you. Nathan frowned slightly. "I've never been inside." Hank looked at him, genuinely surprised. "Well then, I guess Frank never got the chance to show you." He pulled his jacket tighter and stepped out the door. The snow was still falling thick out there. Before getting in his truck, Hank turned back to add one more thing. "If you find the key, maybe you'll understand why this whole valley still remembers your father's name." The red pickup disappeared down the snow-covered road. The garage fell silent again. Nathan stood alone under the old fluorescent lights. The wind howled in the mountains. The radio crackled softly. The smell of burnt coffee still hung in the air. Then he remembered the small metal box Frank always kept in the bottom desk drawer. Nathan opened the drawer. The box was still there. He lifted the lid slowly. Among a few old coins and dead radio batteries was a tarnished silver-colored brass key. On the tag, the handwriting was almost completely faded, "Back room." For the next 3 days, the snow hardly stopped. Silver Peak was submerged in a cold white that stretched from the rooftops to the ice-caked pines on the mountainside. The road in front of the garage was buried several times a day, and Nathan began to understand why Frank had spent most of his life just keeping an eye on the weather. The mountain doesn't care if you're rich or poor. It only cares if your car will start in the middle of winter. Every morning, Nathan woke up while it was still dark. He'd turn on the heater first, then make coffee. Then he'd stand at the garage door watching the steam rise from the old mug in his hands. The garage was quiet in the morning in a way that was very different from Denver. No car horns, no elevators, no sound of leather shoes on hotel marble. Just the mountain wind, the weather radio, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. One morning, near the end of the week, Nathan was shoveling snow in front of the garage when he saw a dark blue van parked across the road. The van was so old its paint had lost almost all of its shine. The back door was sealed shut with silver duct tape. The engine was still running, but weakly. Nathan didn't think much of it at first. These mountains were full of cars just like it, barely running. But by noon, the van was still there. And by evening, as Nathan pulled the garage door down, he could still see a dim light inside the cabin. The wind was starting to pick up. The temperature outside dropped quickly after the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Nathan stood in front of the garage for a few seconds, then finally sighed. He grabbed a thermos of coffee and walked across the road. The person inside the van was a young man, maybe in his 20s. Brown hair a little too long, a worn gray hoodie, and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen enough sleep in days. He flinched when Nathan tapped on the glass. The window rolled down halfway. The cold air immediately flooded the cabin. "Car die on you?" Nathan asked. "Not exactly." The young man hesitated for a few seconds. The heater's not working anymore." Nathan glanced into the back of the van, a thin blanket, a few noodle cups, a small tool bag, and barely any room to spare. He'd seen this kind of life before. Years of running hotels taught him how to spot people who were trying to look okay when they were anything but. Nathan held the thermos out to him. "Want some?" The young man looked at him for a few seconds, as if unsure whether it was some kind of joke. Then he took it. "Thanks." Nathan nodded toward the garage. Sleeping in a car with a dead heater in this weather. Not smart. The young man gave a tired smile. "Trust me, it's not my first choice. Then why not get a motel room?" He looked down at his coffee because motels cost money. Nathan didn't ask any more questions. He just stood there, watching the snow continue to blanket the mountain road. After a moment, the young man spoke. "Eli Brooks." Nathan nodded. "Nathan Cole." Eli recognized the name almost instantly. "This your garage?" "Looks like it," Nathan replied, his voice calm. Eli glanced up at the Turner Mountain Service sign above them. "I thought this place closed down years ago." "Me too." For the first time, the corner of Eli's mouth twitched into a slight smile. Nathan looked back at the van. "Delivery van?" Eli nodded. "Used to make deliveries to the resort on the North Ridge." Nathan knew the resort. For the super-rich ski crowd, winter suites there go for almost $3,000 a night. Get laid off? Eli shrugged. Post-holiday cutbacks. Nathan didn't press him about debt or family. He understood some things are only shared when trust is earned. The wind picked up along the road. Nathan's breath plumed in the cold air. The garage has an old heater in the back storeroom. It's nothing fancy, but it's warmer than this van. Eli was silent for a few seconds. "You don't know who I am?" Nathan nodded. "That's right. Then why are you helping me?" Nathan looked toward the garage, bathed in a soft yellow light. "Because it's cold out here. That's all." Eli watched him for a long moment before finally stepping out of the van. The smell of gasoline and old dampness clung to his hoodie. Nathan led him into the garage. The heater hummed steadily in the corner. A weather radio murmured a forecast in the background. Eli stood in the middle of the garage, looking around as if he'd stepped into another era. "Jesus." Nathan glanced at him. "What?" "The smell. A real garage always smells the same." Nathan let out a soft chuckle. "You've worked on cars?" "My grandpa had a small shop back in Boise." I used to help him out in high school. Nathan pointed to the tool bench. Stay away from the red impact wrench. It has a habit of kicking back on new guys. Eli looked at him for a few seconds, then let out a real laugh for the first time. I'm starting to like this place. That night, Eli slept in the parts storeroom out back. Nathan found him a few old blankets left in a cupboard. No one said much. There were no speeches about how life would get better. Just two men trying to survive the winter in an old garage in the mountains. The next morning, Nathan woke to the sound of soft metallic clinking from the garage. He stepped out to see Eli kneeling by the heater, a wrench in his hand. What are you doing? The heater's making a weird noise from the fan. If we don't fix it, it's just going to die again. Nathan watched him for a few seconds. You really know what you're doing? Eli shrugged. Enough not to blow up the garage. Nathan made coffee. The smell of hot coffee mixed with oil and melting snow from their boots created an atmosphere Nathan was starting to get used to. They barely spoke while drinking their morning coffee. Eli sat on an old folding chair. Nathan stood by the garage bay door, watching the snow fall on the mountain road. The radio crackled softly in the background. It was a comfortable silence, just quiet. Later that afternoon, a local's old pickup died near the gas station at the edge of town. Nathan and Eli took the Chevy out to it. Without being asked, Eli slid under the truck. Nathan stood over him, holding the flashlight. Coolant's leaking from the heater core line, Eli's voice called out from underneath. Nathan nodded. You've got the hands of a real mechanic. My grandpa would cry to hear you say that. The two of them worked on the pickup for nearly an hour in the biting wind. When they were done, the owner paid them in cash, then looked at Eli. Thought you'd have frozen to death somewhere by now. Eli just smiled. Not yet. On the way back to the garage, Nathan glanced at Eli through the snow-dusted windshield. How long's it been? Since you had a steady place? Eli stared out the window. 4 months. Nathan nodded slowly. He didn't ask anything else. That night, after they'd closed up, Eli was sweeping snow from the storeroom entrance when he saw Nathan's standing by the far wall of the garage, holding an old silver key. What's that? Nathan looked toward a small metal door hidden behind a rack of spare parts. Hank said Frank kept a locked room back here. Model Eli stepped closer, and he never opened it. Not yet. Nathan held the key up, looking at it under the soft hum of the fluorescent light. The silver was tarnished with age. Wind rattled the tin roof overhead. The weather radio crackled softly from the office. Eli looked from the dust-covered door back to Nathan. Want to give it a try? Nathan was silent for a moment. Then he stepped toward the old lock. The key turned very slowly. Then a dry click echoed in the quiet garage. The door in the back was finally unlocked. It swung open slowly, its dry hinges groaning in the quiet garage. A rush of cold air and the smell of old paper spilled out. Nathan stood still for a few seconds before reaching for the light switch. No power. Eli turned on his phone's flashlight and handed it to him. The light swept across the small room behind the garage. Dust motes danced in the air. Old wooden shelves lined 3 of the walls. A few metal filing cabinets, maps covered the far wall, and an old radio desk with dozens of faded silver knobs. Nathan stepped inside first. The floorboards creaked softly under his boots. Eli followed, letting out a low whistle. Jesus. Nathan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the wall of maps ahead. The entire Wasatch Mountain Range was marked with red, blue, and yellow pins. Stretches of road were circled in black marker. Snowdrift zone, frequent black ice, avalanche risk. Eli moved in closer. Your old man was a real serious mountain guy, huh? Nathan walked slowly to the radio desk. On the desk, there was still an old headset, spare batteries, a logbook of radio frequencies, and a thick weather log, nearly full. He flipped open a few pages. February 9th. 2 stranded skiers near North Ridge. December 14th. Child missing during storm. January 21st. Truck rollover, Canyon Road. Each entry had a time, coordinates, weather conditions, and Frank's handwritten notes. Eli pulled a crate of files onto the floor. Inside, it was filled with towing slips and rescue records, bound with old rubber bands. He looked at one slip, then glanced up. He didn't charge for a lot of these. Nathan stepped closer to look. Paid later, single mother truck driver, broke, family with kids, no charge. Some didn't even have a name. They just said, safe now. Nathan stood in silence for a few seconds. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly over the old yellowed pages. Outside, the wind kept whipping against the garage door. Snow hit the glass like white sand. Eli opened another box. Photos this time. Hundreds of old photographs tucked into envelopes. Frank standing by his tow truck in a blizzard. Frank pulling a school bus out of a mountain ditch. Frank laughing with a group of ski patrollers by a fire. Frank next to a family with two small children wrapped in emergency blankets. Nathan looked at each photo slowly. He almost didn't recognize the man in them. Not because it didn't look like Frank, but because he had never seen his father through the eyes of others. In Nathan's memory, Frank was just the man who always came home late, the smell of engine oil on his clothes, and the man who fell asleep on the sofa after dinner. But here, in this dust-covered room, Frank was someone else, a man this whole mountain had relied on for years. Eli held up a stack of old letters tied with a red string. "You should read these." Nathan took them. Handwritten letters from years ago. "Thank you for finding our son. If it wasn't for him that night, my family would have frozen to death out on Canyon Road. Frank, I still remember you running through that blizzard just to bring insulin to my mother's cabin." Nathan read each letter slowly. The paper was old and brittle. Much of the ink had nearly faded away. One was written in pencil on cheap motel stationery. Another was stained with old coffee rings. Eli leaned against a wooden shelf behind him. "You know the strangest thing?" Nathan looked up. "What, guys like Frank? They never think they're doing anything big." Nathan looked back down at the letters in his hands. "I know, 'cause his whole life he always said he just fixed cars." The radio out in the garage crackled softly. Weather advisory for northern routes. Nathan slowly walked deeper into the back of the room. On the back wall hung an old contact board. Volunteer Rescue Network. Names were pinned to it: ski patrol, TOW operators, forest rangers, local medics, and right in the middle was the name Frank Cole. Nathan stared at the board for a long time. He'd never known his father was part of a volunteer rescue network. Frank had never mentioned it. In fact, Frank rarely said anything about himself at all. Maybe that was just the way men of his generation were. Get the job done, then go home quiet. Eli opened another small cabinet beneath the radio. He pulled out a thick stack of dispatch notes. "You need to see this." Nathan walked over. Old radio dispatch logs filed by year. Storm rescue, missing hikers, highway pileup. One entry made Nathan stop. March 3rd, 1994. Female driver rescued near Black Ridge Road. Vehicle rollover during snowstorm, transported to lodge, alive. Nathan frowned slightly. Eli looked at him. "What is it?" Nathan shook his head slightly. "Not sure." Just then, the sound of an old pickup's engine rumbled from outside. Headlights swept across the garage door. A moment later, there was a knock. Nathan stepped outside. An old man in a thick sheriff's jacket stood in the snow. The silver star on his chest was so worn it had almost lost its shine. Sheriff Walter Briggs. Nathan remembered him. When he was a kid, Nathan had thought Briggs was born old. Sheriff Briggs brushed the snow from his shoulders and stepped into the garage. "Heard the lights were back on in this place." Nathan nodded. "I guess so." Briggs looked around the garage for a few seconds, then chuckled softly. "Still smells the exact same as when Frank was alive." Eli handed him a cup of hot coffee. Sheriff Briggs took it and nodded his thanks. The three of them stood in the quiet garage. The heater hummed steadily. The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead. Briggs looked at Nathan. "You opened the back room, huh?" "Yeah." The old sheriff nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for that for a long time. "Frank always said you'd come back here one day." Nathan leaned against the counter. "Did people around here really see him as a hero?" Briggs let out a small laugh. "If Frank heard that word hero, he'd probably cuss me out for a week." He took a sip of his coffee and looked toward the snow-covered glass door. "Your father. He was just the kind of man who couldn't leave someone out in a storm." Nathan said nothing. Sheriff Briggs continued. "One time he drove nearly 40 miles in a whiteout just to find two kids who'd wandered off from their ski cabin. Another time, pulled a whole family from a car that went into a canyon, and then there was the incident in '94. Nathan looked up immediately. "What incident?" Briggs turned to him. "You don't know?" Nathan shook his head. The old sheriff set his coffee mug down on the counter. "Victoria Cole almost died on this mountain when she was 23. Nathan was silent. The wind howled outside the garage door. Briggs watched him for a few seconds, then continued. "Back then, she came up here with some friends from Denver. The storm hit too fast. Her car slid off Black Ridge Road in the middle of the night." Nathan felt his throat tighten. Frank found her nearly frozen in the snow. He brought her back to the old lodge south of town. Sheriff Briggs let out a small chuckle. When Victoria woke up, she thought it was the ski patrol who'd saved her. Nathan looked down at the dispatch note, still in his hand, March 3rd, 1994. Female driver rescued near Black Ridge Road. That was Victoria. Nathan wasn't sure what to feel. A strange coincidence. Or something more. Victoria had never told him this story. Maybe she really didn't know the man who saved her was Frank. Sheriff Briggs glanced toward the back room. Frank used to say that girl would go on to do big things in the city. Nathan gave a hollow laugh. He was right. Outside, the snow was starting to let up. A long silence settled over the garage. Then, right at that moment, a pair of bright white headlights swept across the front window. A gleaming black Cadillac Escalade slowly pulled up outside the garage, followed by a brand new Porsche Cayenne. Eli looked through the window and let out a low whistle. Well. Nathan stared at the luxury SUVs covered in snow out in the lot. The woman who stepped out of the Escalade pulled a white fur coat tightly around herself before running toward the garage. She opened the door and stepped inside, her breath coming in short gasps. "Excuse me," she said. "Can anyone here fix a Range Rover?" "We got a warning light halfway up the mountain." Sheriff Briggs chuckled quietly behind his hot coffee mug. He looked at Nathan and shook his head. "Looks like the whole mountain's starting to remember the lights are still on here." After the night the Escalade appeared in front of the garage, things began to change, very slowly. Not the kind of big dramatic change you see in the movies. There was no scene with a long line of supercars suddenly filling the mountain road. No one posted a viral video. Everything happened in a very small way, and a very real one. The woman driving the Escalade that day came back 2 days later to thank Nathan. After that, her husband brought in his Porsche Cayenne to get the brake pads replaced. Then a week later, a friend of theirs driving a Bentley Bentayga stopped by because the heater was failing in the -10-degree weather. It always started the same way. They would walk into the garage, skeptical, glancing at the old sign, at the oil-stained concrete floor, at the heater rattling in bursts, and then at Nathan, a man nearing 60 in a worn flannel shirt and snow-caked boots. But then they would watch him work, and everything would change. Nathan didn't try to upsell them. He didn't talk like a salesman. He didn't make customers feel stupid for not understanding their cars. He just listened to the engine, did his checks, then told them exactly what was wrong. Usually in just a few words. Water pump's about to die. Brake line's frozen. Battery's got maybe another month left. People began to trust him naturally. It wasn't because the garage was cheap. In fact, Nathan wasn't much cheaper than the dealership. But he was honest and calm. In the mountains during winter, those two things were worth more than any advertisement. One morning, Eli opened the garage door and froze. Well, Nathan, making coffee in the back, turned to look. 3 cars were parked in the lot, a white Range Rover, a silver Porsche, and an old Ford pickup caked in slush and mud. Nathan took a sip of his coffee. At least the heater has a reason to keep running today. Eli let out a laugh. The garage started to take on a life of its own after that. Every morning, Nathan would turn on the weather radio at 6:30. The smell of hot coffee filled the space, its yellow light reflecting on the snow outside the bay door. Truckers started stopping by for coffee on their way through the mountain pass. An old chessboard brought in by Hank Wheeler appeared in a corner of the garage. No one remembered who started it, but almost every day, someone was playing a game of chess near the heater. The ski patrol would stop by to fix a snowmobile. Locals would come in to get their winter tires put on. And sometimes, nestled between the old snow-caked pickup trucks, a gleaming Bentley or Aston Martin would be parked in the lot. That contrast always amused Eli. One evening, near closing time, he looked at a brand new Pranti Porsche 911, then over at Frank's old tow truck. He wondered what Frank would say if he saw this. Nathan tightened the last bolt and wiped his hands on a rag. He'd say not to scratch the Porsche's paint. Eli laughed so hard he nearly dropped his wrench. Nathan smiled too. It was the first time Eli had seen him truly smile. Not just a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but the kind of smile that made him look a few years younger. Time started to move differently in the garage. Nathan realized he wasn't constantly checking his phone anymore. He no longer woke up with a jolt of anxiety about work emails. He no longer heard Victoria's voice in his head whenever he made a decision. Instead, he started to notice. The temperature outside, the different sounds of engines, the snowstorm schedules, which customers liked their coffee black, which ones always forgot to check their oil. One evening near the end of the month, Eli was fixing the heater on the resort's snowcat when the weather radio crackled with an avalanche risk warning for the North Ridge. Nathan immediately looked at the clock. There was a resort shuttle that passed through there at 8 p.m. He radioed the ski patrol out of old habit. Eli watched him for a few seconds, and then something clicked. "You've done this a lot before, haven't you?" Nathan paused for a moment. "What do you mean? This kind of thing?" Eli gestured around the garage, knowing what to do before someone gets hurt. Nathan looked toward the snow-covered garage doors. "Maybe I learned more from my father than I thought." That night, the ski patrol did indeed close the route just before an avalanche hit near Canyon Ridge. No one was hurt. But the next morning, a rescue team stopped by the garage with 2 boxes of hot donuts. One of them said, "Frank used to make calls like that for years." Nathan didn't know what to say. He just poured them more coffee. The more people came to the garage, the more stories Nathan heard about Frank. A truck driver told him how Frank had once towed his trucks for free on the very night his daughter was born prematurely. Another guy said Frank once drove 40 miles just to change a battery for an old couple. Nathan was starting to understand that what his father had really left him wasn't the garage. It was a sense of safety in the middle of a mountain winter that was practically priceless. One Friday afternoon, Lauren called him for the first time in almost 3 weeks. Nathan was in the middle of an oil change on a Range Rover when his phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He wiped his hands and answered, "Hey, Dad." Lauren's voice sounded just like it did when she was 16 and felt guilty about something. "Hey, kiddo, everything okay?" "Yeah, it's fine." Nathan glanced over at Eli, who was arguing with an impact wrench on the other side of the garage. "At least no one's blown up the heater today." Lauren let out a soft laugh on the other end of the line. It was the first time Nathan had heard her give a real laugh since the divorce. "So you're really fixing cars?" "Looks that way." "I saw the pictures." Nathan frowned. "What pictures?" Lauren was quiet for a few seconds. "Someone on Instagram posted about your garage." Nathan almost laughed. "My garage is on Instagram?" There was a Bentley in the picture. Nathan looked out at the lot. The Bentley Bentayga was still parked by the light post. "Well, I guess rich people like freezing to death on mountains now." Lauren laughed again. Then her voice got a little quieter. "Dad?" "Yeah, I didn't know Grandpa did so much for people." Nathan leaned against the Range Rover. "Neither did I." A long silence stretched between them. Not an awkward one, just unfamiliar. Lauren lowered her voice. "People in Denver are talking about your garage." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? Some of Aurelia's VIP clients have driven through there. They're saying you're more honest than the dealerships." Nathan looked down at his oil-stained gloves. He didn't know if that made him happy or sad. Maybe both. Before she hung up, Lauren had spoken very quietly. "I think maybe I was wrong about you, Dad." Nathan stood motionless for a few seconds after the call ended. Eli watched him from across the garage. "Everything okay?" Nathan slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Yeah." Then he looked around the garage. The warm yellow lights reflected on the cement floor, the smell of gasoline, the smell of coffee, the quiet static of the weather radio, the sound of melting snow dripping from a car's undercarriage onto the concrete. And for the first time in many, many years, Nathan didn't feel like he was living in someone else's life. Night fell fast out in the mountains. Near 9 o'clock, with the garage almost closed for the night, a pair of powerful white headlights swept across the front window. A black Mercedes S-Class slowly pulled into the lot. Eli peered through the glass, then let out a low whistle. "Well, that's definitely not a trucker." Nathan wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward the front. The car door opened. Victoria Cole stepped out into the lightly falling snow, a cream-colored cashmere coat, black leather gloves, and the same perfect composure Nathan once thought would never change. Victoria stared at the glowing Turner Mountain Service sign for a few seconds before her eyes met his. Then she said, her voice barely a whisper, "We need to talk." The garage fell silent after Victoria stepped inside. Wind rattled snow lightly against the front window. The old heater gave off a steady hum from the corner. Somewhere on a distant mountain road, a tow truck sounded a short blast of its horn, then faded into the night. Eli looked at Victoria for a few seconds, then realization dawned. He wiped his hands on a rag. "I'll go check on that Porsche in the back." Nathan gave a slight nod. Eli disappeared into the repair bay on the left, leaving Nathan and Victoria alone in the middle of the garage, bathed in the yellow light. Victoria slowly peeled off her leather gloves. She surveyed the garage for longer than Nathan expected. The smell of engine oil, the weather radio, the chessboard by the heater, the unwashed coffee mugs. Everything was the complete antithesis of her world. Nathan pulled a folding chair to the table. Want some coffee? Victoria glanced at the old coffee maker in the back, then nodded. Nathan poured coffee into two mismatched ceramic mugs. He handed one to her and sat down across from her. No one spoke at first. Outside, the wind kept sweeping across the mountain range. Victoria held the coffee mug with both hands. This place is colder than I remember. The corner of Nathan's mouth turned up slightly. You used to hate this place. Victoria didn't deny it. I hated how Frank always left the radio on all night. He said the mountains don't wait for a man to get a good night's sleep. Victoria gave a faint smile. That's exactly what Frank would say. Nathan watched her for a few seconds. The strangest thing was he'd never imagined a day Victoria would be sitting in this garage without complaining about the smell of engine oil. The fluorescent light above them flickered slightly. Victoria set her mug down on the table. Nathan, yeah, I didn't come here to argue. Nathan nodded slowly. He knew. Victoria looked him straight in the eye for the first time since she'd arrived. I want to buy this garage. Nathan barely reacted. He just sat there, watching the steam rise from the coffee between them. How much? Victoria seemed a little surprised he'd asked so directly. Whatever is a reasonable price for you. Nathan let out a tiny laugh. That was the kind of thing rich people said when they didn't want to be the first to name a real number. Victoria leaned back in her chair. Fine then. She named a figure large enough for Nathan to live very comfortably for the rest of his life. Maybe even more than that. Outside, the wind continued to howl along the snow-covered mountain road. Nathan took a sip of his coffee, then set the mug down. No. Victoria was silent for a few seconds. I haven't finished explaining. Nathan didn't answer. She looked around the garage one more time before continuing. This whole area is about to change. Nathan frowned slightly. How so? An investment group from Park City is buying up almost all the land around the northern mountain route. A new ski corridor, luxury lodges, private resorts, helicopter access. Nathan listened in silence. He'd heard this kind of pitch dozens of times in the hospitality industry, and he knew they always began with one sentence. This area is about to change. Victoria took a thin stack of papers from her coat pocket. This is the preliminary master plan. Nathan glanced over it. New roads, new resorts, private cabins, a high-end retail village. And Turner Mountain Service was situated almost right in the middle of the connecting route. Nathan looked up. They want this place, Victoria nodded. Not just this place. The entire stretch of road around the canyon ridge. Nathan leaned back in his chair. So why are you the one who came here? Victoria was silent for a few seconds before answering. Because I know they won't be as polite as I am. Nathan let out a small, dry laugh. It was the first time in years he'd heard Victoria say something so honest. The heater made a soft clicking sound as it adjusted itself. Eli was doing something in the back of the garage. The short buzz of an impact wrench sounded, then fell silent. Victoria glanced in that direction. Does that boy work here? Just staying for a bit. Victoria nodded slowly. He used to say this garage would end up being a place people came to when they were in trouble. Nathan looked at her. Frank said that? Victoria nodded. Back when I was young, Nathan was quiet. Something very small had changed in the way she spoke of Frank now. Less cold, less distant. Victoria looked straight at him. Nathan, listen to me. If you sell now, you'll have more than enough to live comfortably. A condo in Salt Lake. Good insurance. No more fixing cars in the middle of the night in this weather. Nathan looked down at his hands. Engine grease was still stuck in the creases of his palms, no matter how many times he washed them. He remembered the penthouse in Denver, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the $10,000 espresso machine, the heated marble floors, and that suffocating feeling every single morning when he woke up. Nathan looked around the garage, the soft static from the radio, the smell of coffee, melting snow dripping from the undercarriage of the Porsche behind them, an old chessboard, the warm yellow light in the middle of winter. Then he looked at Victoria. I don't want to sell. Victoria didn't react right away. She just watched him for a long time. Nathan realized the strangest thing wasn't that she was here. It was that he could finally say no to her without feeling afraid. 31 years. He had always been the one to give in. Changing schedules, changing plans, changing his life. For Arella, for the image, for the business, for Victoria. But not this time. Victoria seemed to realize it too. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled very slowly. I thought you would sell immediately. A small smile played on Nathan's lips. I used to think so too. A long silence settled over the garage. The wind outside had died down. The radio was forecasting clear skies for the morning. Victoria looked around the garage one more time. So people really come here just to get their cars fixed? Nathan nodded. And for the free coffee, Victoria let out a soft laugh. It was the first time Nathan had seen her laugh without it feeling like a social performance. It reminded him of the young woman who'd sat beside him in Frank's old pickup more than 30 years ago. Before everything became business-class flights and charity galas, Victoria was the first to stand. I tried to help you the only way I knew how. Nathan looked at her. I know. And for the first time in many years, it wasn't a fight about who was right and who was wrong. Just two people who had loved each other for so long, but had lost their way years ago. Victoria put her gloves back on. As she reached the door, Nathan spoke. Victoria, she turned back. Thanks for coming yourself, instead of sending a lawyer. Victoria looked at him for a few seconds. Then she gave a very slight nod. The Mercedes S-Class pulled out of the garage a few minutes later. Its red taillights faded into the curtain of snow. Nathan stood at the garage entrance, watching it go for a long time. Eli emerged from the repair bay in the back. Well, Nathan breathed out a thin, white plume of air. Yeah, she's just as scary as I imagined. Nathan let out a small chuckle. Sometimes, even more so. Eli leaned against the garage doorframe. Nathan looked at the reflection of the Turner Mountain Service sign on the window pane. No, Eli nodded, as if he already knew. Just then, Nathan saw a white envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of the Chevy in the lot. He walked out to get it. The embossed logo of a Denver law firm was in the top left corner. Nathan opened the envelope right there, under the yellow porch light. The cold wind gently flipped through the legal papers inside. Official notice regarding land acquisition review. Standing behind him, Eli skimmed a few lines and swore softly. Nathan looked down at the blue legal seal at the bottom of the page. So the lawyers came after all. Things started to get worse about a week after that first legal notice. At first, it was just polite emails. Then came the phone calls. Then, men in expensive coats started showing up at the garage with smiles that were a little too professional. Nathan barely needed to read their business cards to know what they were. Development consultants, land acquisition specialists, regional investment partners. They all spoke with the same voice. Calm, polite, and dangerous. One morning, a young man in a navy cashmere sweater walked into the garage just as Nathan was changing the oil on a truck driver's Ford pickup. He looked around the garage for a few seconds before smiling. Mr. Cole. Nathan didn't look up. If you're here for a repair, get in line behind the Porsche. The man let out a soft laugh, as if he'd been trained to never get angry. I'm here on behalf of the Black Ridge Development Group. Nathan tightened the oil cap, then stood up slowly. Outside, the snow was melting. Water dripped from the truck's undercarriage onto the cold cement floor. The truck driver in the back glanced at the man, then went back to silently sipping his coffee. Nathan wiped his hands on a rag. I believe I've read your letters. The man nodded. We truly want to resolve this in a way that benefits everyone. Nathan almost laughed. People always say that right before they try to take something from you. The smile on the man's face tightened slightly. He pulled out a portfolio. This land is set to be rezoned in the next few months. The luxury ski corridor will bring hundreds of millions of dollars to Silver Peak. Nathan glanced over the development plans. New hotels, private villas, a shopping district, a helipad, and right in the middle of it all was Frank's garage. He handed the papers back. I'm not selling. The man was silent for a few seconds, then nodded as if he'd expected it. That is your right. Before leaving, he looked around the garage one last time. It would be a shame for a place like this to be left behind by the future. Nathan watched his black SUV disappear down the mountain road. The truck driver sitting by the heater snorted. City folk always talk like that right before they break something. Nathan didn't answer. He looked at the reflection of the Turner Mountain Service sign on the steam-covered glass door. For the first time, he felt a real sense of worry, not for himself, but for this place. In the weeks that followed, the pressure began to mount. The zoning inspector showed up, then the environmental review, then a demand to upgrade the water system. One day, Nathan received a notice that the garage was in violation of winter parking standards. Eli looked at the stack of papers on the table and shook his head. They're trying to wear you down until you just give up. Nathan knew that, and he also knew he didn't have enough money to fight it for long. A lawyer in Salt Lake quoted him a consultation fee that was nearly all the money he had left after the divorce. One evening, near closing time, Nathan sat alone in the small back office. The radio played soft country music in the background. The heater hummed gently. Outside, the wind howled through the dark mountain range. He looked at the stack of bills on his desk and let out a bitter laugh. For his entire life, he had helped manage five-star resorts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And now, he was trying to figure out if he had enough money to replace the heating system before the next storm season. There was a knock on the front door. Nathan thought it was a customer. But when he walked out, he stopped short. 3 large trucks were parked outside the garage. Hank Wheeler got out first. He was followed by the 2 truck drivers, whose rigs Nathan had fixed for free a few weeks back. Then another pickup truck pulled up behind them. Nathan looked at them. "What's going on?" Hank handed him a large cardboard box. "We heard about the zoning thing." Nathan frowned. "And?" Hank shrugged. "So we came." Nathan opened the box. Inside was cash. Not a lot compared to Victoria's world, but it was a whole lot for working men from the mountains. Nathan immediately shook his head. "No, I can't take this." A trucker standing by the garage door spoke up. "Frank once replaced my transmission and told me to pay him back whenever I could. I never paid," another man spoke up. "He pulled my truck out of Canyon Road when my boy was in the ICU in Ogden." Nathan looked at them, not knowing what to say. No one made a big speech. No one tried to turn it into some cinematic, emotional moment. They just stood there, in the warm, yellow light of the garage, surrounded by the winter. Tired men with hands calloused from the cold. And Nathan started to understand what Frank had really built here was never a business. It was trust. After that night, more people started showing up. The ski patrol brought over old weather logs, proving the garage had supported mountain rescue operations for years. A local mechanic offered to help upgrade the water system, free of charge. Resort guests Nathan had rescued during snowstorms posted reviews online. A small article about Turner Mountain Service appeared in the local paper. "The garage that never lets the mountain freeze alone." Eli read the headline and laughed. "Sounds like a Netflix documentary." Nathan was nearby working on a snowmobile. Don't let the internet give you a big head. But even with everyone helping, the pressure didn't stop. Blackridge started pressuring the town council to fast-track the rezoning. Rumor was, a few landowners around Canyon Ridge had been strong-armed into selling for way below market value. One evening, Sheriff Briggs came to the garage, his face grim. He placed a file on the table. Nathan scanned a few lines, then looked up. "They're bribing the zoning board?" Briggs nodded. "Not enough to put anyone in jail, but dirty enough for the press to love it." Nathan leaned back in his chair. "So why are you showing this to me?" The old sheriff looked around the garage. "Because Frank pulled my son back from freezing to death in 2001. A long silence hung in the air. Then Briggs added very quietly, "And because this place is worth saving." A few days later, Victoria returned. She wasn't in the Mercedes this time, just a less conspicuous gray Range Rover. Nathan was changing the brake pads on a Bentley when he saw her standing at the garage entrance. Victoria looked around. The garage was much busier than the last time. Truckers were drinking coffee by the heater. 2 ski patrollers were playing a game of chess. The weather radio was crackling with a black eye ice warning for the North Ridge. And Eli was arguing with an old man about how to fix a carburetor. Victoria walked in slowly. Nathan wiped his hands and looked at her. "This is bigger than I thought." Victoria nodded. "I know." She looked around the garage for a long time before speaking. "Blackridge wants to force the zoning board to approve the project before the end of the quarter." Nathan wasn't surprised. "And where do you stand?" Victoria looked at him. Nathan realized she was truly tired this time. Not the kind of tired from a gala or a business flight, but the kind of weary that comes when someone starts to realize they've been wrong about something for a very long time. "I thought you'd sell it immediately." Nathan remained silent. "I thought you were just clinging to the past." Victoria looked at the people sitting and drinking coffee by the heater. Then she looked at Frank's tool board. "But this isn't about the past, is it?" Nathan looked around his garage, the smell of oil and gasoline, melting snow, A quiet laugh, the soft crackle of the radio. No. Victoria lowered her voice. This is the first time I've ever seen you truly belong somewhere. Nathan didn't know how to respond because deep down he knew she was right. 31 years in the world of luxury hotels, and he had always just been the man who kept things running smoothly. But here in this old garage, he was finally himself. Victoria watched him for a few more seconds, then said quietly, "You were never weak." Nathan gave a small smile. "Just, never lived for myself." Victoria nodded very slowly. Outside, the wind began to pick up. The weather radio suddenly crackled loudly. Major winter system approaching northern corridor. Eli looked up from the workbench. Uh-oh. Nathan walked to the garage door. In the distance, beyond the mountain range, the sky was turning a dark, almost black gray. The wind whipped snow across the road. Just then, Sheriff Briggs appeared at the door, a tense look on his face. The storm front just changed direction. Nathan looked at him. How bad? Briggs looked toward the dark clouds rolling down the Wasatch Range. Worst of the year. Then the light outside the garage flickered as the first gusts of the big storm swept through town. The storm hit faster than forecast. By 9 p.m., the road in front of the garage was almost invisible. The wind howled along the Wasatch Range like tearing metal in the night sky. Snow lashed down in sheets so thick, the porch light was just a hazy orb in an endless white. The garage lights were still on. The heater rumbled steadily in the corner. The smell of hot coffee, snow-damp coats, and engine oil mingled in the air, an atmosphere that had become familiar to Nathan. The truckers were still there. 2 of them were asleep by the heater. The ski patrol was listening to the weather radio, their faces tight. Eli stood at the garage door, looking out into the curtain of snow. I hate to say it, but old man Frank would have loved a night like this. Nathan looked at the mountain route map spread across the table. He'd be cussing us all out for not topping off the diesel in the tow truck. Eli let out a laugh. And just then the radio crackled to life. Vehicle stranded near Canyon Ridge. Possible family inside, visibility near zero. The garage fell silent. Nathan looked up. Every eye was on him. No one said a word. But Nathan understood. It was like they were all thinking the same thing. Frank would have gone. Nathan put on his coat. Eli stood up immediately. I'm going with you. Nathan looked at him for a few seconds, then nodded. Sheriff Briggs stepped closer. It's bad up on Canyon Ridge tonight. Nathan grabbed the keys to the tow truck. I know, the wind blasted in as the garage door opened. Snow immediately flooded in like a white wave. Frank's old tow truck gave a heavy roar before plunging into the storm. Nathan could see almost nothing beyond the yellow glow of his headlights. Eli sat beside him, gripping the radio. Snow drifts on the left, he shouted over the wind. Nathan kept a tight grip on the wheel. He'd driven in storms like this long before he ever met Victoria, and his body remembered everything. Don't look at what's right in front of the hood. Look where you want the truck to go. Frank's voice echoed from somewhere deep in his memory. The radio suddenly crackled to life. Possible SUV near mile marker 18. Nathan slowed down, the headlights cut through the thick curtain of snow, and then he saw it, a Lexus SUV, tilted, with half its tires in a snow-filled ditch beside the guardrail. Its hazard lights were still blinking faintly. Nathan slammed on the brakes. The wind nearly ripped the door off as he and Eli jumped out. Inside the SUV was a family of 3. The father was trying to keep the heater running. A little girl was crying in her mother's arms. Nathan knocked hard on the window. Everyone okay in there? The man cracked the door open. We've been stuck for almost an hour. Nathan looked at the child in the back. Her lips were starting to turn blue from the cold. He turned to Eli. Blankets. Eli immediately ran back to the tow truck. Everything happened fast after that. Tow chains, spinning tires, the howling wind, snow plastering his coat. Nathan shouted instructions over the storm. Then, finally, the Lexus lurched back onto the road. The mother started crying almost immediately. Nathan stood panting in the snow. The cold wind sliced across his face, and in that moment, he understood how Frank lived his entire life. Not because he loved the danger, but because he couldn't rest knowing someone was out there, stranded. When they got back to the garage near midnight, the lights were still on. And what made Nathan stop in his tracks was the number of trucks parked outside. It seemed like the whole town had shown up. Truckers, ski patrol, local mechanics, the people of Silver Peak. Even a few wealthy resort guests were inside, handing out hot coffee. The garage was packed with people. Warmth, The low murmur of voices, the smell of melting snow, a weather radio, and the yellow light reflecting off the old cement floor. Nathan walked in with Eli, the wind still howling behind them. No one clapped, no one made him out to be a hero. A truck driver just handed Nathan a cup of hot coffee. The way you'd take care of someone who's just come home. Victoria was standing near the office door in the back. She was wearing someone else's heavy jacket, her hair a mess from the wind and snow. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Victoria walked closer. You okay? Nathan took the hot coffee. I'm okay. Victoria looked him up and down. Then, very quietly, she said, I've never seen you like this before. Nathan knew what she meant, not more tired, but more alive. The storm continued for most of the night. People took turns monitoring the radio. The tow truck went out and came back. The garage became the thing Frank had always made it into every winter. A beacon of light in the middle of a blizzard. Around 4 in the morning, the wind finally began to die down. The radio announced that Canyon Ridge Pass was safe again. Many people had fallen asleep slumped over in folding chairs next to the heaters. At some point, Eli had crawled under a pickup truck and fallen asleep. Nathan stood alone at the garage entrance, watching the sky slowly begin to brighten beyond the mountain range. Snow covered the entire valley. It was so quiet he could hear the coffee dripping from the machine behind him. Victoria came and stood next to him. They didn't look at each other. They just watched the winter sun slowly appear from behind the gray clouds. Blackridge was investigated this morning, Victoria said softly. Nathan turned to her. Sheriff Briggs sent the files to the press last night. Nathan was silent. Victoria pulled her coat tighter. Aurelia's board just cut ties with them too. A cold wind swept across the snow-covered yard. Nathan looked at Frank's old tow truck, parked under the Turner Mountain Service sign. So, this is it then? Victoria shook her head, just slightly. No. Then she looked at him. But I don't think the winner this time will be the one with the most money. Nathan didn't answer. He just watched the garage lights, still glowing against the white winter morning. A few months later, spring came slowly to Silver Peak. The snow melted into small streams running down the mountain road. The garage awning was repainted. Eli fixed Frank's old neon sign. Now, every night the word Turner glowed a steady pale yellow in the valley. A new wooden sign was hung next to the door. Coal Mountain Rescue and Service. Truckers still stopped by for coffee. The ski patrol still listened to the weather radio by the heater. And sometimes, among the mud-caked pickups, there'd be a Bentley or a Porsche parked in the lot. Nathan didn't find it strange anymore. One early summer afternoon, Lauren drove up the mountain with her 2 young sons. Nathan stood outside the garage, watching the boys run around the parking lot, their laughter echoing in the afternoon sun. Lauren walked over to her father. This place is so different from how I remember it. Nathan looked up at the new sign above them. It's different from how I remember it too. Lauren was quiet for a few seconds, then rested her head gently on his shoulder. I'm sorry I didn't understand before, Dad. Nathan watched his grandsons curiously fiddling with a toolbox near the garage door. It's okay, kiddo. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to show the boys how to check the oil in the old Chevy. The smell of gasoline and oil, the sound of the weather radio, the late afternoon light, and somewhere out on a distant mountain pass, a tow truck's short horn blast echoed through the valley. Night fell slowly over Silver Peak. The garage lights came on, cutting through the cold mountain mist. Nathan stood alone at the entrance, watching the yellow light reflect on the last patches of old snow. The radio played the familiar weather report. A light wind whispered through the pine trees. Then the emergency line rang. A stalled car out on Canyon Road. Nathan looked out into the night. Then he put on his coat, not for money, and not out of a sense of duty, but because somewhere out there, someone needed to see that the light in this garage was still on. And at 58 years old, Nathan Cole finally understood that a man isn't measured by what he owns, but by the number of people who breathe a sigh of relief, knowing he'll still show up in the middle of a blizzard. If you ever thought a man's worth was measured in money, status, or what people see on the outside, then maybe Nathan Cole's story will make you think again. In the heart of Silver Peak's harshest winter, what kept people alive wasn't the 5-star resorts or the $100,000 SUVs. It was an old garage with its lights still on in the blizzard. And sometimes, the greatest wealth a person leaves behind isn't property. It's the feeling of safety someone gets when they hear the sound of an engine cutting through the night. If you enjoy grounded, cinematic stories with this kind of humanity, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. And remember, somewhere out there, there's always someone who needs a light that's still on.